So welcome to week 10. So this is a bit of excitement for me, this restoration lecture, presentation. In that it links to what exciting thing I did the last week or so as well, where we were looking at some restoration projects, some new ones. And I could talk for a very long time and give you lots of examples from the literature and lots of information about coastal and wetland ecosystem restoration. There are so many papers out there, there's so much information that I don't want to bore you on a Friday afternoon too much. So I thought what I'd do is I'd break this presentation up into a bit of background information, I suppose, some summary information, and then a few case studies that I've been working on for the last couple of years, just as a way of trying to impart some of the experiences that we've had in this space. That first photo there was taken in 1994, I think. So what's that, 30 odd years ago? And it was a program, this is in Tully, so just a few hours north of us, Tully, where the farmers, sugarcane farmers, wanted to increase production because that floodplain stays underwater for long periods of time. Sugarcane doesn't like to be underwater for too long. So as a way of getting around that, they were digging these holes across the floodplain and using that material to raise the sugarcane up in the paddocks nearby. You can see in the background there where they've been digging and moving the sediment. And these holes in the ground have become really important coastal wetlands. They've been constructed. They are now providing incredible fishery production. They didn't realise that at the time, but they've turned into these incredibly important ecosystems now on the floodplain. Fisheries, I've seen some of the biggest crocodiles I've ever seen in some of those lagoons there. Water quality, there's carbon benefits. When we surveyed the farmers recently, the farmers were telling us also that they have a human health, well-being service that these wetlands are providing. The farmers are pretty stressed, right? So they drive past their wetland and can just mentally defrag a busy day. So really important services they provide. So an example of a restoration project, I guess. I had a postdoc a few years ago. I gave her the challenge to look at the literature and try and trace back when we started to do this idea of restoration. And she went right back to the 1930s, so good on her, when restoration was really first appearing in the literature, I suppose. And this is in terrestrial habitats, right back in 1935. About 1950s, we started to see, I guess, some of the larger scale restoration projects. Again, this is all in terrestrial habitat. About the 1950s, 1960s. And in Australia, the first real success for restoration was in about the 1960s. This guy Morris in Broken Hill, did some restoration work on, again, terrestrial habitats. So really in the early part of the history of restoration, it's all focused on terrestrial environments. And I guess that makes sense because terrestrial environments are very easy to access. When you talk about wetlands, wet areas, it's actually quite hard to do work there. There's seasonal constraints, there's safety issues, those sorts of things. It wasn't until this guy, Wilson, who really in the early 1990s, he published a really important quote, I think, that he made this prediction. Remember, this is sort of 30 odd years ago. He made this quote that the century that we're currently in, he considered, is going to be a real era of restoration, the need to go back and restore some of our lost and modified ecosystems across the world. So 30 odd years ago, we first started to recognise the fact that we are degrading and we're changing, altering, losing our ecosystems across the world, again, terrestrial and aquatic. Which is really interesting because you look at this paper by Young, this was published in 2005, and there's a graph in the publication there shows a number of articles that were linked to restoration. About 1990, it's almost zero for a long time, and then it just took off. So restoration became a really important response to the damage, the loss, modifications we were having on the world's ecosystems. There was this real increase in the number of projects undertaken and certainly were being published in literature. So I thought that was really interesting. So I said to my postdoc, okay, let's dive into this a bit further. This is really interesting. So 400 odd papers up to about 2005 were published. So, as a scientist, we're thinking, what sort of habitats are they focused on? What sort of, got some visitors watching us. What sort of habitats are focused on? What success they were having? What sort of costs there were? Those sorts of things. I started to think about, well, let's put some context around this. It wasn't until sort of 1993 that the first real wetland restoration paper published in the journal came out. So, again, this is sort of 30 odd years ago. As a science, we're quite young in terms of our knowledge and experience within the area of coastal wetland restoration. So it's still quite young. In fact, in the Great Barrier Reef catchments, I'd argue that we've only been doing this really effectively in the last 5 or 6, 7 years at most. We've really been sort of looking at this question of coastal wetland restoration, and I've got some case studies I'll talk to you about shortly. So what are the aims, what are the objectives of all this work? There are some really high-level statements that have been set by the United Nations, UNESCO, some of these really high-level environmental organisations. These statements, these goals are really, really important because it sets our target, where we want to achieve, what we will achieve in the next few decades. The Bond Challenge is a really interesting one. It's aimed at trying to protect and restore degraded ecosystems, 350 million hectares by 2030. Well, it's not too far away. In fact, we're probably below that target. A bit more work to do in that space. There's a 2020 vision. Africa 100, again, there's another big vision there around trying to protect and restore these damaged ecosystems. And these are high-level statements, but really important to have these in place. They're terrestrial statements. High-level statements in terrestrial sense. So when we look at our coastal areas, our coastal wetland areas, we're talking about 4% of the Earth's surface. This is the area that's touching land and water, 4%. And you guys know very well now, because you're in week 10 of this subject at least, that a large part of the population is living along those coastal areas, because we love the lifestyles and livelihoods that the coastal area provides us. Fisheries, social, cultural, those sorts of things. This number is probably going to change. We're just talking about Florida, and poor Florida has had some interesting times. The Florida and the Everglades is in pretty compromised, modified, changed state. There's been a huge amount of investment in trying to reconnect, reflood, deal with the water quality issues, invasive species issues in the Everglades. And there's been in the order of about 10 billion spent in trying to protect and restore the Everglades. And there's still massive problems that, I don't know if anyone's been there. Big challenges with phosphate, invasive species, altering hydrology, those sorts of things. In China, they've been spending a lot of money, 100 billion since 1990. This is in published papers. They've damaged a lot of their systems, so they should be spending a lot of money to try and repair and restore these important habitat areas. And in Queensland, good on us, in about 6 or 7 years ago, the Queensland government made a commitment of $500 million, so $500 million, going back into restoring, just in Queensland, our ecosystems, so terrestrial, but also our aquatic, our wetland areas. Because we've damaged them so much, we need to go back and protect and restore them. So It's a small amount of money, but certainly it's good that they've made that commitment. So one of the challenges you have straight away if you're going into a restoration project is you're in a degraded state. You're starting off in a situation where ecosystem that you're concerned with, and the scale is relevant here. It's a degraded state, and then you have a desired state. So where do you want to be? I think that's really important to have that vision, that goal set really early. And really importantly, and Kev Hayne mentioned it this morning, having all the stakeholders involved in that meeting is really important so that you set that restoration goal. It's agreed to, everyone's signed off, everyone's endorsed that, comes then the expectation that you are heading towards. And I can give you tens and tens of examples of where that's been so important to have those meetings early. To give you some examples where it's gone bad as well, maybe one day. So with the ecosystem value and restoration goals that you've set, what does that actually mean? What does the restoration goal actually mean? What's the measure of success that you're going to set? That needs to be clearly defined. What's the restoration success? What does that look like? Is there, as part of that restoration project, is there a structural metric that you're going to use? So maybe you want to increase the complexity of mangrove ecosystems within your area, or maybe the salt marsh vegetation, the structural complexity of that. It's really important to be quite specific about where you want to be with your restoration success. Maybe there's some sort of functional role that you want to measure. I think Kev this morning mentioned this biodiversity markets. Biodiversity markets, carbon markets, but biodiversity markets is something that's talked about a lot now. And there's a workshop only a week ago where it was heavily focused on biodiversity outcomes. You have to restore the biodiversity values back in the system. And I keep saying, well, what do you mean by biodiversity? What do you mean? Usually that is number of species, but restoring a number of species isn't really necessarily looking at the functionality of that system. I think there needs to be a bit of a close think about how you define your restoration success. If it's biodiversity, it's a functionality. Is the system you're restoring going to be functionally viable in the future, more so than the species that you're protecting? You might be thinking about landscape, so the context. How big is the area you want to restore? Remember, in coasts and estuaries, these are multi-directional, multi-functional habitats we're talking about. We're not talking about a single habitat. So you might restore one part of the estuary, but that might have important impact or consequences in an adjacent estuary, for example. The analogy I give usually for offsets, we talked about offsets, I touched on it this morning briefly. In the marine sense, in the coasts and estuaries, if you destroy or develop an area because water moves around that disturbance, your footprint, development footprint, the dust goes a long way because we have water as the conduit to move around. It's the same for restoration. You may restore one part of an estuary, it might have positive benefits somewhere else. So scale, landscape becomes really important as part of your criteria. And maybe you've got a compliance criteria. That's kind of the most common reason why restoration projects are undertaken. You have a compliance thing. If you destroy that, you must protect something else. It's a compliance side to it. So that might be another measure of success. So really important as part of setting your restoration goals, that you're defining what that success is going to look like. Be quite clear about that. It's really important. So, how is that really complex now in estuaries and coasts? You guys know what Ramsar wetlands are, right? What's a Ramsar wetland? Week 10. prehensile wetlands. These are important coastal areas, vegetation that are underwater or wet at least for a small part of the year. These are coastal wetlands, these are Ramsar wetlands. These are our estuaries, our tidal flats, our salt marshes, mangroves, seagrass, coastal floodplains, alluvial, lacustrine wetlands, all those are important Ramsar wetlands. So if we have a restoration project that is focused on just salt marsh, that's great. You're restoring that salt marsh habitat, but maybe there's important reasons or consequences or benefits beyond that. Remember, we have estuaries and coasts, there's water moving around, we're all connected in important ways. This paper was published by some colleagues in South Australia only, well, a few months ago, really. Oh, August, there you go, August 2022. This is the first paper to talk about multi-habitat restoration. In 30 years, the effort has been focused on just single habitats, just salt marsh, just seagrass, just coral, floodplain wetlands. We're now starting to think, hey, these are complex systems we're dealing with in estuaries and coasts. They are connected in so many important ways that we need to think about them in a multi-habitat perspective. I think this is pretty obvious, but a really exciting piece of work that's been done to show the benefits that you can achieve by a multi-habitat, a whole system approach to restoration. So you might be really surprised to think that after 30 years, this is the first paper to deal with this. I think it's good, it's about time. But it's the first paper to really talk about that concept. So, as part of my ask of the postdoc to look at all the restoration papers published, she did a really good job. She built this wonderful database and spatially presented all the papers that she found. These are published papers on coastal wetland restoration projects. You can see the distribution there across the world. There's a few in Australia, good on us. America, doing well, a lot of work done there. I suspect a lot of that's on tidal marshes. Africa, South America, yeah, the UK is doing okay. New Zealand's not so well. Asia, not so well. That's the distribution. That's good, Okay, we've got an idea of where these studies are. So I asked, well, can you break that down into habitats now? Let's look at the different habitats there. And so she did a really good job color-coding each of those studies, and it turns out that the bulk of those projects that are published are on salt marsh or tidal marshes, as I refer to in the US, tidal marshes. Yeah, most of those in the States, some estuaries, tidal flats, coastal lagoons, mangroves, freshwater creeks. No seagrass, it's interesting. Seagrass is hard to restore. The reason for that is seagrass is underwater a lot of the time. It's affected by turbidity runoff or nutrient runoff, so it's going to be hard to restore seagrass. I suspect that's probably why there's very few examples. In fact, there's a few that have been published since Christina did this work. Okay, so that's really interesting. Let's go a bit further. Let's look at the timeline now by habitats. And so the first one was, well, back towards 1990, a little bit before 1990. It's interesting. Given I just said the first one was published in 1993. I'll have to quiz Christina on that. Might be an error. So there's the distribution by habitats. And you can see we've got this upward pattern happening, so more and more papers are published. Those first few years, up to about just after 2000, were mostly in salt marsh areas. In fact, salt marsh, again, it dominates in the last 2 decades or so. But what I find interesting here is, since then, there was a year there when only salt marsh was published. That's really interesting. And a year where there was no salt marsh papers published. But you can see some of these other habitats are coming through. And in fact, the number of salt marsh publications is getting less and less, and being replaced with mangroves, intertidal mudflats, coastal lagoons. So that's interesting. It's good. We then asked the question, well, what's the value, the restoration value that they're aiming for? And overwhelmingly, a lot of them were looking at restoring the ecological function back into these systems, so 87%. About 6% social reasons, so it might have been cultural, or maybe there's some sort of aesthetic reason for the restoration project. And I found really interesting that only 3% of the reason they were undertaking those restoration projects was for an economic return. And that's really interesting given the current climate now, where we're trying to incentivise, I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, incentivise restoration projects. 3%. Okay, that's good. So we then asked of the data, what's the restoration approach by habitat? And mostly these projects were using some sort of hydrological modification to get the restoration outcome. So changing the hydrology. Maybe they were doing some dredging works or building channels, removing earth walls, possibly with tidal gates to restore these habitats. But there were other restoration approaches as well. Looking at constructing wetlands, some sort of vegetation approaches there. Success evaluation, study design. So there were a lot of the projects, this is good to see as a scientist, that included a reference as part of their experimental design. So they had their impact site and had their control or reference site as part of the design. So good on them for doing good science. Several had before-after experimental designs and looked at some sort of threshold effect too. Only a few of those. But most of them had pretty well useful design because they had reference and control sites in place. So that's good. We looked at then, what did they use, what metric did they use to measure success? And a lot of them used vegetation cover or some sort of vegetation metric as a way of measuring success. Fish, invertebrates, soil, water quality, birds, there's a whole list of others broken by habitat down. So overwhelmingly, they're restoring these habitats for a vegetation outcome. So that's good. Maybe it's a carbon outcome. It's good to see. How long were they measuring success? This is where it gets a little interesting. Most of the projects were about sort of 3 to 5 years. That's how long they were doing some sort of check or an evaluation of the success of that project, between 3 and 5 years. That probably aligns with funding cycles. Most of the funding we get, if you're lucky, 5 years, mostly 3 years, certainly 1 to 2 years, in my experience. So not very often you'll get up to 20 years of funding, but it turns out a few studies had actually achieved that. Some also less than 1 year, which is a bit of a concern given I'm not sure how much you can measure success in less than a year. So, okay, so between 3 and 5 years, which is probably not too bad. But where that gets interesting is, remember how I talked about this desired state you want to achieve. There's also natural variability. Once you go from your degraded state to your desired state, it's going to be natural variability. I've got a good case study to show you how that becomes really important. So could you actually, in 3 to 5 years, go from a degraded state to a desired state? Could you actually measure that? Don't have the answer to that, but something to think about if you're entering into a restoration project, the length of time you want to measure success. And as I said, there's a whole bunch of papers I could throw or email. I'll email you lots and lots of papers, and you'll spend a lot of time reading a lot of these papers. And I'll give you some. I haven't uploaded them today yet, but I will. Some really important papers I think you should have a look at. But the purpose of that was just to go through and give you an overview of all this work that's been done, the kinds of things that they've been measuring, for how long, indicators of success. The importance of having good experimental design, so reference controls as part of your restoration project. And that seems to be aligned with what we see in the literature, so that's useful. So is restoration possible? What do you think? Can we actually turn degraded habitats back into ecologically functioning systems that mimic the natural environment? Is it possible? Takes a while.
Depending on the environment.
Yeah. A functioning freshwater wetland, a constructed freshwater wetland, would take 15, 20 years to mature. Takes a long time to get the carbon levels in there, get the right amount of nutrient balance, to get denitrification happening, to get those water quality outcomes. It takes a while for them to mature, so it does take a long time, definitely. Does it mean it's possible or not? Well, I think it's context specific. I think it depends on the habitat, depends on the location, depends on the rainfall. If it's maintained properly, I think these are some really important underlying concepts we're thinking about as you start restoration projects. Megan's written a really good paper on how we can go looking at these kinds of restoration, vegetation restoration projects in an urban context. She poses in that paper that it is possible, but it's very difficult because we've got this grey infrastructure on coastline areas. It is possible, but we have this grey infrastructure, and it's always changing as well. There's a concept called the Nighting Unknown. This is a concept where we have unknown unknowns. This is a concept where we have unknown unknowns. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. We don't know. There are unknowns in the future too that we don't know about now. I think I got that right. That's important, and that's hard to try and manage, to try to set up as part of your restoration goals. How do you know unknowns? What unknowns are out there? You don't. They're unknown unknowns. But we need to be aware of that. We need to have some sort of contingency built in for these things, these challenges that may emerge. And particularly difficult in these contexts, in some of these complex habitats that we're talking about in coastal estuaries. We published a technical report only a few months ago. This was funded through the Australian government. And a bunch of us got together and we're all working on restoration projects, different parts of the country. And we got together and thought, how do we actually try and rally together the troops working in this space of coastal wetland restoration? What are some of the fundamental gaps and challenges, barriers that we have to deal with in Australia with these restoration projects? And we wrote this, it turned out to be a way too big report. It's 170 pages. It's way too big. This roadmap to a coordinated landscape approach for restoration in Australia. And this, not only a big document, it importantly identified what are the emerging challenges that we have if we are going to get serious about restoring the coasts and estuaries within Australia. So we went through a whole series of workshops and interviews. We had Indigenous group members contribute. There's about 170 stakeholders, 170 stakeholders we spoke to. And we developed this roadmap. And the roadmap outlines some of the important steps or principles that we need to solve if we want to have a coordinated approach to restoration of wetlands, coasts, and marine areas in Australia. And the first one, so this is in rank order, the first one is co-design is central. Co-design is central. That means that we have to have everyone at the table agreeing on the restoration goals, vision is. If we don't have that, then we can't set up a project for success. Co-design is central, absolutely. All sectors have to be at the table. The next principle, number 2, is a approvals, governance. There is a lot of red tape that's in place at the moment that prevents us upscaling coastal restoration in Australia. I'll give you a couple of examples. Colleagues in Sydney who do that living seawall work, where they're putting tiles on the seawalls in Sydney, they have to get approval to do that. And their last big project they did was a 3-year funded project. It took them 18 months to get the approval, just to put the tiles on the wall. 18 months. A 3-year project. That leaves 18 months, thereabouts, for them to do the monitoring of success. Do you think they'll be able to show success in 18 months? Probably not. Another example. Innisfail. I worked with the local council there. They were upgrading their rock wall. And they wanted to put some green engineering into their rock wall. We put these fish hotels. These are concrete devices with holes in them where fish can hide. As part of that, the conditions of approval were that after 3 years, because we're dumping in the marine park, we have to remove those structures after 3 years. That's governance. That's a problem. It's a big problem. And it's so big that we have to deal with that straight away. So we've got some more funding that's coming through soon for us to work on this problem with the legislation barriers. How can we expect to get to these kinds of restoration targets that's affordable, at scale, and that's meaningful if we have these incredibly complex government approval processes in place? We've got to break that down. There are a whole bunch of other steps there, from no-gap funding to evidence-based approach, coordination, robust monitoring, clear strategy for climate change, nature-based solutions, and sharing information collectively. And if we get all that together, then we have a clear roadmap for restoration in Australia. We've got some big challenges ahead of us if we want to get serious about restoring our coasts and wetland estuaries in Australia. Some really important steps there. So can restoration be successful? Well, yes, but there's some important things we need to first work through. There's important barriers we need to break down. I want to just have you think a bit more about this idea where we have an original state and we know we're going to degraded states, even highly degraded states in some situations when we've just changed entirely the coast and estuarine ecosystems. Maybe there's been a regime shift, so there's a trophic shift possibly, or a functionality shift. Can we actually restore back to the original state? Can we go from a highly degraded state back to an original state? I don't think we can. I think getting back to an original state of functionality in our coast and wetland areas is probably not possible. Unfortunately, we have, in some way, in some form, touched or damaged ecosystems all around the world. I think that's probably about right. So can we go back to original state? I don't think we can. I don't think we can ever get back to what it was a long time ago, unfortunately. I think we have to compromise and go to some sort of a hybrid state or an altered functionality. So changing our expectations. One of the early figures I showed you, slides I showed you, how you need to go from a degraded state to your desired state. I think thinking very carefully about what your desired state is important because there's a cost associated with that. So your expectation, your restoration goal has a cost. And maybe you don't have all the money to get to that desired state, so you have to have an altered state, which does have some reduced level of service. Maybe you can't eat all the fish in that wetland. Maybe you can't swim in that particular estuary. A bit difficult to think about that, but at something we have to be certainly aware of because we have modified and changed our coast suggestions so much. If we have lots and lots of money, remember Everglades 10 billion, China 100 billion, and they still have not reached even close to an individual state. It's got to go back to a hybrid state at some point. So just be aware of that as a concept when you're setting up your restoration projects. Okay, so let's look at some case studies. Are there any questions to that point? Okay. So, feral pigs. I think, Troy, you've seen a couple of these slides. Maybe some others have as well. So feral pigs are a huge impact on our coasts and estuaries, our wetland, our Ramsar wetlands in Australia. We have anywhere between 4 and 21 million feral pigs in Australia. That's a big range. 4 to 21 million feral pigs. I think what that means is we just don't know how many pigs there are. There are a lot. They're causing massive damage to our wetlands. So we've been doing a lot of work in Cape York, looking at trying to repair and restore wetlands and controlling feral pig damage. This is one of the local rangers that we've been working with for a long time now in Cape York. That photo is really interesting in a whole range of ways. That ranger was not only proud to have shot that pig, but he did say to me that we were doing such a great job controlling the pigs on that property through our wetland restoration work. I'll show you some slides. And pig numbers were going down, so there was some effect happening on the pig numbers, the threat on the wetlands. But he said to me, "You're doing such a great job, Nathan, that we're concerned because the pigs provide a good source of protein for our local community." You want the pigs? Do you want your wetland? What do you want? What's the value? So we had a really interesting conversation. Had to revise our management approach to this particular project. So we managed as much as we could the wetlands, but we didn't get rid of all the pigs because they provide an important protein source. It's this balance between expectations and values that you have to be thinking about with your restoration projects. So we put in these fences around the wetlands, keeping the pigs out. You can see in a couple of years there's some pretty good recovery there. If we were using vegetation cover as our metric there, there's lots of native lilies and Helicarus and other freshwater plants are growing back there. So we're doing a pretty good job. Looks good. Very turbid water, very clear water. So that's looking pretty good. I wasn't just happy with the vegetation cover as a metric of success. I wanted to look at the fish community as well. And I've never been so nervous in my whole life putting out fight nets in these wetlands where there are monster crocodiles living there. But we did. Don't tell anyone, I'll get into trouble. Across these floodplain areas, we put out some hydrolabs, so these are measuring water quality. That's a multi-probe that measures every 20 minutes oxygen, temperature, how salty the water is, and pH every 20 minutes. We usually leave them out for a few days. We want to see how water quality changes day and night. So what we're also very interested in is what's the temperature regime in pig-damaged wetlands, in these more deep, persistent wetlands. So these are not that impacted by feral pigs, usually because they're big, they're deep, they have big crocodiles there, so they keep the pig numbers under control. And then also in our fenced wetlands, so ABC. So this is the temperature regime there. This is the percent of time for each of these wetland types that were 20 degrees, 25, 30, 35, 40 degrees. The percent of time across that logging phase. This is about a week of 20-minute logging. And And you can see B and C, so our persistent wetland and our fenced wetland, the water temperature never got above 35 degrees. But our impacted wetland, it reached 40 degrees, even for a few hours of the day. So a low percent of time. So that understanding that thermal regime becomes important if you're a fish and you have a certain acute thermal tolerance. So we did some really neat temperature experiments for a bunch of freshwater fish species. These are pretty common freshwater fish species. Some of these are important for indigenous cultural consumption, the sleepy cod. We ran some experiments. And I wanted to know at what temperature point those fish species, they don't like it. They need to escape. Too hot. It's the acute thermal tolerance. So it's the point at which, in a short temperature range, short temperature duration, that they have some response. They need to move. Usually they jump out of my bucket, basically. They all recover, don't worry, I'll let them all go in. So once we know those numbers, we can apply to our graph. So for each of these fish species, they have an acute thermal tolerance of somewhere between 36 and maybe 37 degrees. So that's the point at which they respond. They need to get away. It's too hot, basically. So what this graph shows us is our wetland B and C, our persistent wetland and fenced wetland, had water temperatures well below the acute thermal tolerance for those fish species. That means the temperature never gets to the levels where the fish would have to have some response. Our impact wetland exceeds those threshold points. So there are periods of the day, several hours, where in a pig impacted wetland, water temperature gets above the acute thermal tolerance for those fish species. Those fish have to find some sort of thermal refugia, an area of the wetland that's cooler in those pig impacted wetlands. And fish don't have to do that when you have fence around the wetland and get the vegetation back, or in those deep water, big persistent wetlands across the floodplain. So that's really interesting to think that if you're a fish and you're in a wetland impacted by pigs, that you're going to be faced with this exposure, this risk effect. So fencing wetlands allows the vegetation to come back, which provides that thermal refugia for fish. So that's an important indicator, important outcome. So there's a measure of success, restoration success. So there's my piggy. He's digging around. A really good source of protein for pigs is freshwater turtles. Freshwater turtles provide a really important source of protein for feral pigs that are in these wetlands, unfortunately. We saw loads of examples of where the pigs have gotten to these freshwater turtles. So putting a fence around a wetland for species of freshwater turtles that need to move across the landscape, particularly when they dry out, that becomes a real problem. And they hit the fence. Turtle can't get out of the wetland. They've got to go and find water. So having a fence stops the pigs getting to these wetlands. The vegetation can come back, providing a thermal refugia for fish. But there's a problem for freshwater turtles. Freshwater turtles can't get up and move around. So what's your value of the wetland? Is it fish or is it freshwater turtles? How do you manage the wetlands when you have different values, different expectations? We turn to science. And science can help. Science can solve it. So there's my turtle, my freshwater turtle. There's the fence. So these are a pretty standard fence. They're called dog chain fence. I think they're kind of 150 by 150 square panels. They're about a metre high. They're pulled tight and star pickets around the edge of the wetland. They're tied off to trees to get the tension right. So it's used anywhere in North Australia, this technique. If you're a turtle and you're bigger than the size mesh fence and you want to get out because it's dry and move, it's a problem. This little guy found he was struggling to get out. So this is a problem. So how do we solve this? We release this guy, don't we? What we did was we did this experiment where we simply removed a piece of wire. That piece of wire there, let's say we cut that piece of wire out. So this 150 by 150 became 150 by 300 now. This is much larger for the turtle to get out. We did a whole range of experiments where we timed how long the turtle took to find the opening. Would it find the opening? Would it go through the opening? How far do we space these openings? 1 metre, 2 metres, 4 metres apart. We did all those experiments. And it turns out these turtles, we did this for a few different species of turtles, will find and go through our turtle gate, call them turtle gates. So a simple management response, in addition to protecting the wetland from feral pigs, removing a simple piece of wire, helped immensely in protecting also now our freshwater turtles. But this idea to simply remove a piece of wire, unfortunately wasn't my idea. I might claim it. We published a paper on it. My name's first. But the ranger, one of the rangers, talking to the ranger, he just said to me one day, we're talking, he just goes, well, why don't you just cut a piece of wire out of that? Not thinking of something really expensive that I could make lots of money out of. A simple technique like that, simple practical technique like that, solved that problem with the turtles. Also being able to benefit from putting fences around wetlands. So a fence around a wetland keeps pigs out, allows the vegetation to grow, providing the thermal refuge for fish, and now the turtles can find these openings and get through them and continue on their life. I think that's great. So we progressively solve this problem. There's a whole bunch of numbers which I won't go into. Fish, turtles, crocodiles. Okay, how do we deal with a crocodile that's 5 metres long? This guy was 5 metres. And we found him in the wetland, it was drying out. And it's amazing to think this guy, I'm assuming it's a guy, I wasn't going to ask him. This guy could progressively follow the water table down by, I guess, moving around and digging that hole. And they've got to stay wet, they don't want to dry out, overheat becomes a problem. How do we now deal with crocodiles that need to also move on the landscape? Any thoughts on that? I don't know. Yeah, tough luck. This guy, we came back a few weeks later and it had rained and I presume he'd moved on, I don't know. We had ideas to try and lasso this guy and try and drag him out through the fence to the nearby creek to let him go, but as I say, I reckon easily 5 metres, that's a big crocodile. Remember how I said I used to go in and put the spike nets in the wetland? Quickly rethought my approach to doing something. I've just brought more students with me. They went to so that was good. I don't know how we solved that one, but this is, there's pros and cons with our restoration approaches, I suppose. We think we've solved one challenge and we've measured some success, but maybe there are still other pieces of the puzzle that we think about. So it's not actually always very easy to do restoration projects. I've talked a little bit about the Burdekin floodplain. I think in the last, before the break, I talked about Crooked Waterhole, where we had a lot of excessive nutrient runoff, for instance from sugarcane areas, going into our creek, which runs through this slide. We have barramundi and mangroves down the bottom of this particular restoration project site. There are a lot of aquatic weeds and problems with dissolved oxygen there. And we were having massive fish kills there. So, you know, there's a need to try and restore this particular wetland area. So, using the removal of the vegetation, this is just before the project. So, oxygen levels are yellow dots there. You can't see them because it's zero. There's no oxygen available there because of the organic load. When we removed the vegetation, the oxygen levels started to come back. And that was a really, really good indicator that we achieved some improved functionality for that wetland. And our electrofishing sampling of catching barramundi, so really good outcomes there. That's before and that's then after. So we've done this, all this aquatic weed removal. That line there is the boundary with the neighbour, and the neighbour wasn't interested in working with us. So that's why there's no removal of vegetation on there. I want to talk about Mongala because this is probably one of my, it's got a big place in my heart, Mongala wetlands. So this is near Ingham. It's about an hour or so drive north of Townsville, near Ingham on the coastal floodplain there. It's a really flat country. This is an elevation, digital elevation graph, so you know it's quite low, quite flat country there. And this wetlands, the coastal wetland, has mangroves, has salt marsh, has melaleuca, so some really important natural values there. There's a strong connection with the indigenous group there, the Ngawagi family, the Ngawagi clan. They have a really strong connection to country there. And they talk about this serpentine, which in the day used to be able to meander its way up the catchment to the freshwater regions of the area there. But now with sugarcane and agricultural development, it's very impacted and they are deeply scarred by the land use change there and the degradation of this wetland. This serpentine now can't go back up the catchment. It's blocked by the damage caused to this wetland. But there's this really, really rich and deep cultural connection to the wetland there. So the Mongala Station, it's about 850 hectares in size, right on the coastal floodplain there. And I'll go back to this previous one. Back in the 1920s, there was a homestead. It was about here, in that cleared area there, a homestead built. He was a potato farmer from Scotland, owned the property there, and he wanted to move his house from there to where it is now, which is up there. It's about 5 kilometres or so, no, maybe 4 kilometres. And the reason he wanted to move that was because there's lots of sandflies and midges there. That's a problem, right? So to move that distance, he built through the wetlands this bund wall. So this is an earth wall that was constructed, this is back in the 1940s. Earth wall so he could move the homestead across the land there. That earth wall became a tidal barrier. So the tide couldn't go beyond that earth wall. Once the earth wall was stopped. On the upstream side of the earth wall became a freshwater wetland. And up until about the 1990s, the freshwater wetland, turned into a really degraded state. There was lots of invasive freshwater weeds, water hyacinth, harmonacne, salvinia, water lettuce, a bunch of others. And that freshwater wetland above the earth wall, these freshwater weeds really overtook the wetland and became a really degraded habitat. So there were very few fish, very few birds living there. The water quality was terrible. Again, the serpentine couldn't go up yet, couldn't go up that creek system. So really, really sad story there. And in fact, Bulgaroo and Annabone, these are all become so overgrown with vegetation, weeds, huge problem. So about 2010, CSIRO and our group looked at ways of trying to remove these freshwater weeds, these freshwater problems, try and restore connectivity there. And previously they'd been using herbicides to get rid of the weeds. That's a problem, right? Because you don't want to have pesticides going out to the roof. So we did some experiments. We had a master's student here who looked at how salty does the water need to be to kill those freshwater weeds. And once we knew that, can we actually engineer that earth wall, remove it, put a hole through it, and allow the tide to come back to naturally destroy those freshwater weeds? That was the hypothesis. We use tide to, and the ingress of that water to kill the freshwater weeds and restore the habitat back there. So CSIRO did some pretty fancy modelling, looking at hydrodynamics, and they worked out where along the wall and how big the opening needs to be to maximise that salty water ingress and kill the freshwater weeds. So that was all done. All the modelling was done. So that's what it looks like in 2010. This is that's water hyacinth. It's a South American freshwater weed, pretty common in most parts of the world, freshwater weed. There's our bund wall. The blue is the tide, and as you see, it doesn't get past the bund wall. We only had a couple of species of fish that we were recording on the upstream side in the freshwater area, surprisingly, given how weed choked it was. So just adding a bit of salt, getting the tide back. There's the modelling. So 2013, we sent the excavator in. The excavator dug a hole through the wall. So here's some engineering works that are going on into the wetland there. And I have, and to this day still, this is now nearly 10 years, I have these loggers in the wetland that measure the water depth, how salty the water is, and the temperature of the water. And these are positioned at different measurements upstream of the earth wall. When the earth wall was removed, we had a tide signal. So marine water is about 56 millisieverts. So that was marine water. Then had rain, and then we had some salt coming back in a couple more times over the next 12 months, the next 2 years. So our loggers were measuring that the tide was coming back in and ingressing into that wetland where we'd opened the wall. So it was working. It's good. Let me show you before and after photos. This is before, the salted water couldn't get above the wall. After we'd opened it and the tide was coming in, those freshwater weeds disappeared, gone. Our freshwater native plants, the lilies and Elycaris, were coming back just wonderfully. So it's a great story, great success story. And social media, I think Kev talked about social media this morning, the power of social media. You know, traditional owners tackle wetlands, restoration, historic situation, great outcome. With my electrofishing boat, this is about 2014, it's catching small barramundi, so they could get past the wall now, so we're having some good success, there's good intentions, good outcomes. This project was so successful and the social media around it. Richard Branson from Virgin got wind of this story. Indigenous connection, restoration success, and gave $1 million to the Milwaukee group to continue the work in this wetland. And in addition to the $1 million, he named one of his virgin plains the Mungala. And it's incredible to think that the power of social media and some good science showing success can lead to these great outcomes. However, that was 3 years of work. Remember how I said in one of my earlier slides, most funding cycles is 3 to 5 years at most if you're lucky. Those first 3 years, first 3 years, we showed that the tide was coming in, wetlands drying out, all these weeds are being destroyed. You'll see some water coming there in a minute. And the values were being restored back there. This is a great outcome. However, if we had stopped the monitoring in this wetland, this is why to this day my loggers are still there every 20 minutes recording these numbers, we would not have found that Like Troy's question, how long does it take to restore a wetland? These wetlands take a long time to mature. And those first few years of restoration were in a dry season where we were getting the tide coming back. Sorry, the tide was coming back. These great outcomes, but we had low rainfall in the wet season. So low rainfall, low fresh water coming down the catchment. The tide could maximise its ingress those first few years. We then flipped into a series of higher than average rainfall years, really high rainfall years. And the system went back into being a freshwater dominated, weed infested wetland. So it's oscillating between these wet years and dry year systems. So to this day, this has been now nearly 10 years. If we were to go to Mungala, and did anyone go to Mungala the week before? No, there was a field trip, I think, for another subject. Okay. It's completely covered in weeds at the moment because we've had a number of strong wet years. And so without now 7, nearly 10 years of science, understanding, monitoring, we wouldn't know that this wetland flips between these dry year, salty, low weed to freshwater, weed-infested wetland system. So investing long-term into restoration monitoring is important. It's really, really critical. We have a completely different conclusion now to what we had in those first few years. And I'm the first to admit that I got it wrong after those first 3 years. I thought we'd solved it. I thought we'd got this great success. But it turns out that we're still learning more about this wetland. So restoration long-term becomes really important. We're doing more experiments now where we're looking at using salty groundwater to help supplement some of these upper areas. So we're doing the field work now, looking at these saltwater bores to see whether that can assist us further with getting more salt upstream of the bung wall. Watch this space. I don't know the conclusions yet, but we're working on it now. This is... I'm being recorded, so I'll move away. This is some of the most exciting stuff that we're doing at the moment. This is sugarcane. It's a sugarcane property that is underwater because of the tide and the rainfall. And so this is what I call marginal cane. This is on low-lying areas that used to be under sugarcane about 20 years ago. But with sea level rise, these areas want to reflood again. And so this is a fantastic opportunity to turn this into a coastal wetland. So we have, on this site, already started to plant melaleucas. We've got a couple of thousand melaleucas in there now. Only within probably 2 years, it's much taller than me. Turning these areas that were once sugarcane back into a coastal wetland is really exciting. We've got probably about 1,000 hectares of areas that we're currently mapping and building together to be a large restoration project. So I'm really excited about this. I don't want it to be recorded because I want someone to steal my ideas. This is really exciting. So we've mapped out all these areas that are marginal cane, and we've done a lot of economics. So what's the value proposition? It's important when you start to think about restoration for wetlands. What's the cost or the benefit for those restoration efforts? So we've done a lot of calculations there. It turns out if we build a wetland for ecosystem services, so fishery production, it's going to cost us about $10 a kilo of DIN reduced. So that basically means that every $10 we spend, we'll get a kilo of dissolved inorganic nitrogen reduction if we build a wetland for ecosystem services. For water treatment, it's going to cost us a little bit more because these are expensive engineered systems. So $20 to get 1 kilo of DIN reduced in terms of return. And I put this in there not to say that we need to take jobs away from people, but the Queensland government currently have what's called an extension program where they pay this team of people to go out and talk to farmers to try and improve their practices, improve water quality. And that's costing us about $50 a kilo per DIN reduced. not saying we need to stop these people, they're doing great work, but it's actually much more affordable for us to be turning these areas into wetlands. I've talked about that one. So we're going to talk about, I think it's next week, talk about market mechanisms. You've heard a little bit about that, I think today, and maybe in previous lectures I've talked about how do we turn coastal wetlands into money. This becomes important if you're a farmer. You're a sugarcane farmer. You want to turn that marginal sugarcane into a wetland, it's going to pay you to do so. And there's a scheme called reef credits, which is available right now, where farmers can turn these non-productive cane into a wetland, and improving water quality gets paid a reef credit. It's a payment for them to build these wetlands. Now the value of that reef credit hasn't been quite determined. We're so close to finishing this work. There's me and a bunch of others working in this space. So paying farmers to get rid of these marginal cane, to improve water quality by building these intercepting wetlands. So here's a restoration project that will pay for a reef credit for water quality improvement. Let me take this a bit further. A reef credit plus a carbon credit now. Blue carbon. If we have mangroves coming back and we're providing water treatment benefits, it's possible that these wetland restoration projects could pay a reef credit and a carbon credit, and then Kev mentioned today a biodiversity credit. Now, these are all coming at us really fast. These are what we call market mechanisms. And they are a really important way where we can get at upscaling coastal wetland restoration projects. At the moment, I heard 2 weeks ago, the United Nations Framework for Climate Change Commission, the UN Climate Change Commission, quote that it's going to cost us about $1.3 trillion per year for us to protect and restore our coastal wetlands. $1.3 trillion. Where's that money going to come from? Government don't have that money. Big companies that want to offset their carbon or improve biodiversity or buy reef credits is where we're going to get that money. Big corporations. That's where we're going to get this money to raise the capital to invest in protecting our coastal wetlands and restoring our coastal wetlands back to a hybrid state. $1.3 trillion. If you have all these pipelines of funding coming in, a reef credit, a blue carbon credit, a biodiversity credit, my concern is that you have now a very complex situation. Who manages all these funds? Who determines where the money is best spent? What's the prioritisation around those pipelines of investment? At the moment, in the reef space particularly, there is a lot of excitement about investing in these kinds of projects. So we wrote this paper last year, and it was about this idea of you need to have this common asset trust. So a group of people or an organisation that basically, where the funding comes in, and it's their job to trust, to implement and audit and check these restoration projects. We reviewed 16 market mechanisms across the world as part of this paper. And all of them are failing because there is no framework, there's no governance, there's no way of reporting in a consistent and a meaningful way. They're all failing because there is no single management of all these pipelines of funding investment. So we're proposing, this is why I'm keeping it secret, for my marginal cane, that we have to have these kinds of systems in place. It's how we're going to get scale. It's how we're going to get this to this roadmap of restoration in Australia. So let me go back to my original slide. So here we are in the UN decade on ecosystem restoration, which is, we're only about a year into it now. So what does this look like for the next 10 years? What does our restoration decade on ecosystem restoration look like? I'm working there. You guys are going to be working there. What do you reckon we're going to put in here? What are the learnings? If I were to come back to you and talk to you about this in 20 years' time, what do you reckon we're going to have there? What are we going to add in? It's up to you guys. That's your job. It's my job. It's our job to try and set this, to come back and try and get serious about this wetland restoration idea. There are so many jobs. If you haven't got your CV ready by now, we can get it ready. Even Kev Kane said to us in the presentation this morning, like, he wants to employ you guys. Because he's doing this kind of stuff. It's Port Authority. These guys are all employing the Nature Conservancy, WWF, Green Australia, Kiltaroo, which is an insurance company, governments, natural resource management groups, are all employing people to do wetland restoration projects. Green Collar, Green Fleet, TEM, these guys are for-profit carbon companies that are employing people to come and work on coastal wetland restoration projects. TEM, so this is Tasman Economic Management, TEM, this is how I possibly beat you, Megan, what we did last week. I literally flew in from Papua New Guinea last night, 10 o'clock. I was with these guys on Manus Island looking at a blue carbon restoration project. This is David and Gabrielle from TEM. These are a carbon company, and they have big investors from Singapore, and we're looking, this is what I did last week, like just a few days ago, looking at mangrove restoration sites on Manus Island. This is in Papua New Guinea. This is with Professor Chalawan. This is the president of the provincial for Manus Island, president. This is from Papua New Guinea University. We were going around looking at restoration sites. We've got now some project sites that we're going to set up for the next couple of years. So we look at blue carbon, look at biodiversity, look at water quality outcomes. TEM are looking for project officers. So they asked me to mention it to you guys. They want really smart people to go and work for them. Have your CV ready. So this is real. This is restoration's happening. This is only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And they're looking for people to think about and approach these kinds of projects and achieve success at scale and using market mechanisms to fund it. There are big companies that want to invest in these kinds of projects. So if you're interested, come and talk to me. These guys are looking for people. So David, he's in Singapore. He works out of Singapore, and he's looking for 5 project officers in Thailand. So I don't know if that beats your citizen science diving, but yeah. So the learning. So 35 years of business, and I don't think we've got it right yet. I think there's still a lot of science to come. I think each restoration project should be considered as an experiment in its own right. I think we need to come in with control and reference sites. We need to not just go in blindly to do restoration, pull some weeds out, plant some trees. I think we need to think about this much more carefully as part of our approach to this. We need long-term data. Remember my Mangala story? I got it wrong the first 3 years, but we're now understanding that. We need maintenance funding. So funding long-term to try and protect and maintain those natural assets that we're restoring. We need to publish the failures. All those papers I just walked you through are all papers where they show success. How many out there were not published because they were unsuccessful? I think a lot. I think that's a shame. We should be publishing that and sharing those failures. Failure's not the right word. We should show and be talking about where we've had those challenges and not had those successful outcomes. There's still lots that we don't know about coasts and estuaries, and I'll come back to my last point, that you need to work as a community. And these are complex ecosystems. We're talking about coasts and estuaries, complex ecosystems. And it's going to take an ecosystem of people to restore and protect them. Are there any questions?
With that publishing phase, is that something that will get published?
No.
Sorry.
No. It's really hard to publish. Well, that's not true. There are journals a bit lower in terms of the impact factor that will accept the papers where you haven't had a success. It's how you craft and pitch the story, I think, is the tricky bit. But for high tier or high profile public journals, as yet they won't publish it, unfortunately. Yeah.
One of the first slides you had up was the one where like China had like 100 million or however much it was. How does it equate to success? Like, are they more successful because they put more money into it? Like, have we been more successful because we have better scientists?
We have better scientists. Maybe. We don't know. No, we don't know. So this is the cost-benefit analysis, and we haven't looked at. There's another couple of papers which looked at the cost benefits, and it turns out that it is very expensive to do coastal wetland restoration. It's expensive to do it. My Manus Island example there. To put mangroves back in the ground, to try and repair some of these damaged areas. So these are areas damaged because the community are removing the mangroves to build their house. That's interesting in its own right. To go back and plant mangroves in really remote areas, and it was hard to get into these places, it's expensive. And so I think the cost for restoration and the benefit for that is going to always show it's not going to work. But that's for blue carbon. This is where the idea of bundling those services, so biodiversity, water quality, as well as carbon becomes really important. You can get multiple pipelines of investment. I think that's where they can become profitable and cost effective. There's not a lot of science and data on that just yet. This is still coming through the system.